West Virginia, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, 1942. Somewhere on this hillside behind 30 years of vines is a door no one has opened in a very long time. Inside a limestone cave, a mushroom farm still producing, still breathing, maintained by someone who has been coming in silence once a week for years, keeping it alive without telling anyone why. And deeper still, behind a wall of hand-stacked stone, a sealed room, a flat stone in the center, an envelope placed there on purpose for a specific person, a girl who left an orphanage this morning with a cloth bag, $1.60, and no idea any of this existed. She is walking up the mountain path right now. The day Iris Blackwood turned 16, Sister Agatha called her into the office and told her she was no longer the state's concern. The state's concern, as if she were a crack in the pavement, a busted pipe, something the city had finally decided wasn't worth the paperwork. Sister Agatha was a small woman who took up an enormous amount of space, not in the way of heaviness, in the way of certainty. She sat behind her desk and opened a brown envelope and spread the contents across the blotter with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times and felt nothing about it. A lawyer in Boone County has been in contact, she said. West Virginia. Your maternal grandmother one, she squinted at the paper. Flora Blackwood has died. Iris did not move. She had not known there was a grandmother, not a Flora Blackwood one, not any kind. She left you her estate, Sister Agatha said, and then she did something that Iris would remember for the rest of her life. She stood, she carried the letter to the dining hall. She read it aloud in front of every girl at every table and every nun who happened to be present, because of course she did. 14 acres of steep wooded hillside in Keeney's Creek Hollow, a dwelling in disrepair, a limestone cave formation of no commercial value, currently inaccessible due to overgrowth. The laughter started at the back of the room, then spread, moved through the dining hall, the way a cold draft moved through a drafty building. One table, then the next, then the next. The nuns did not laugh. They smiled in the way that people smiled when they had decided that someone else's misfortune contained a lesson for the rest of the room. Sister Constance put her hand over her mouth. Sister Margaret looked at the floor, and every girl in that dining hall looked at Iris with the same expression, pity mixed with relief that they were not her. Iris did not cry. She had stopped crying at St. Agatha's Home for Girls around the age of 12, which was the year she understood that tears were a currency that bought nothing in a place like this. Nothing. Not sympathy, not relief, not one additional biscuit at supper. She had cried every night for 2 years when she first arrived, and the supply of sympathy she received in exchange had been so precisely zero that she eventually stopped making the transaction. She sat at her table and listened to the letter being read and looked at the words on the wall calendar. March 14th, 1942. She thought 14 acres. She thought inaccessible due to overgrowth, which was not the same as empty, which was not the same as worthless, which simply meant that no one had bothered to clear it, which was a different thing entirely. Her mother had died of pneumonia when Iris was 10 years old, not scarlet fever, not something dramatic, just a long, slow winter cold that became a chest infection, that became a fever that her body did not have the resources to fight because they had been living on whatever her mother could earn from taking in laundry, and laundry was cold, wet work that was not kind to a woman's lungs. Her father had gone into a coal mine in the spring of 1932 and not come out. She had been 6 years old. She remembered the morning not clearly. the way you remembered things that happened when you were 6, which was in flashes and impressions rather than continuous narrative. Her father's coat, the smell of it, the sound of her mother starting to cry at the door and then stopping, because stopping was the only way some women knew how to survive what they were given to survive. They found his lamp at the site. They did not find him. After her mother died 4 years later, the state had done its accounting. No father, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins who wanted a thin girl who read too much and talked too little and had strong opinions about things that little girls weren't supposed to have strong opinions about. And so the state sent her to St. Agatha's Home for Girls in Charleston, where the Sisters of Mercy spent 6 years attempting to produce something useful from the raw material of her. A laundress, a seamstress, a future wife for some farmer who needed an extra pair of hands more than he needed a conversation partner. She was none of those things. She was the girl who stole books from the donation bin and read them under the blanket by candlelight until the candle ran out and then lay in the dark thinking about what she had read. The girl who asked the science teacher at the public school they attended 3 days a week why plants grew toward light and whether you could trick them into growing toward a mirror. The girl who kept a notebook full of drawings of leaf structures and root systems and seed cross-sections filled in at every spare moment. 7 notebooks, now all hidden under the loose board at the back of the closet where Sister Constance never looked, who once got the back of her hand hit with a ruler by Sister Constance for spending an hour watching a vine climb a stone wall instead of scrubbing the laundry floor. "You are wasting your time," Sister Constance had said. Iris had looked at the vine, had thought, "I don't think I am." Now she sat in the dining hall and listened to the laughter die down and watched Sister Agatha fold the letter back into the envelope. She thought about a word: inaccessible, not destroyed, not empty, not worthless, inaccessible, which meant there was something there, something that simply required the effort of access, which was in her experience the situation with most things worth finding. She packed her cloth bag that afternoon, 3 dresses, a pair of stockings, the 7 notebooks she had been keeping since she was 11 full of plant drawings and observations and questions she had never been able to answer because there was no one to ask, the $1.60 she had saved from doing extra kitchen duty when no one else wanted those shifts, a photograph of her mother, the only one she had creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. She said goodbye to Mardell Hicks, who had slept in the bunk below hers for 3 years and who cried in a way that was entirely genuine and entirely inconvenient. "Don't," Iris said. "You'll be fine, Mardell." She did not know if that was true, but it was the right thing to say. She walked out the front door of the Sisters of Mercy Home for Girls and did not look back. The bus dropped her in Whitesville on a Thursday afternoon in late March. The town was small and gray in the particular way of coal towns that had been waiting for a prosperity that had arrived once and then left and hadn't come back. Buildings that leaned, storefronts with paint peeling in large, deliberate sheets, the air carrying sulfur from the nearby processing plant, and underneath that something older, rock and cold water, and a distance that was different from city distance, wider somehow, more honest about itself. The lawyer's name was Pemberton. He was waiting outside a building with a hand-lettered sign that said law, and looking at his watch when she arrived. He was a man who had the shape of someone who had once been larger and had deflated slightly with time. Round face, tobacco-stained fingers. He looked at her with the specific assessment that men like him made when they saw someone young and female and alone and caring very little, which was the assessment of a man calculating how much a situation was going to require of him. He offered his hand and she shook it. "Your grandmother was a particular woman," he said, on the drive up into the mountains. Iris filed this away. Particular. She was learning that this was the Appalachian way of indicating that someone was strange in a way the speaker found difficult to categorize. Did anyone know her? Iris asked. Knew of her. She grew things, had a garden people talked about, though most never saw it. Once the cave got overgrown, she stopped letting anyone near the property. Last 10 years of her life, nobody went up there at all. Why not? Pemberton drove around a sharp curve without slowing and did not answer immediately. Like I said, particular. He left her at the end of the path. 2 ruts in the mud disappearing into rhododendron so thick it made a green tunnel. He gave her a key, a $3 bill, a handshake that contained, if she was reading it right, something adjacent to an apology without the actual word. The cabin is about a quarter-mile up, he said. Cave is behind it somewhere. Entrance been swallowed by kudzu for 15-20 years. Never been inside myself. Don't know anyone who has. Why didn't she clear it? Iris asked. Pemberton shrugged. Like I said, he drove away. She walked up the path alone. She was 16 years old. She had a cloth bag and 7 notebooks and a grandmother she had never met who had left her a cave. She had no money to speak of, no skills that anyone had thought worth developing, no plan beyond the next hour. She thought this is either the beginning of something or the end. There was no middle ground. The cabin was small, but the walls were solid. 1 room, plank floor scrubbed clean and worn smooth from decades of use. A stone fireplace on the far wall that looked like it had been built to last a century and was well on its way. A wood stove in the corner. A bed with a frame that didn't creak when she sat on it. A roof that needed work at the northeast corner where the ceiling had darkened with damp but had not critically fallen. Flora Blackwood's possessions were sparse and strange. A table, 2 chairs, jars of dried herbs along every windowsill, labeled in handwriting that was small and precise and slightly right-leaning. Not the herbs from a kitchen garden. Iris didn't recognize half the names. She pressed her nose to one of the larger jars and inhaled something green and medicinal and very old, the smell of a knowledge that had come from somewhere specific and taken a very long time to accumulate. The books. She had never seen so many books in a private home, floor to ceiling on improvised shelves along 2 walls. Not novels, not Bibles, books on soil chemistry, on mycology, on what the spine of one called permaculture, which was a word Iris had never encountered. A botany text that was falling apart from use, its spine repaired with cloth tape so many times the tape had tape on top of it. Books with diagrams of root systems, books with tables and formulas, books with passages underlined in that same small, precise hand, and annotations in the margins that were sometimes longer than the original passage. Diagrams pinned to the walls with the systematic density of someone who needed the information visible at all times. Cross-sections, annotated drawings of fungal networks spreading through wood grain, maps of the hillside behind the cabin with numbers and notations marking soil depth and sun exposure and water movement at different seasons. Iris stood in the middle of the room and turned in a slow circle. Whoever had lived here was not what they had seemed. On the table, as if it had been left out for her, was an open journal. She moved toward it. The pages were written in that same small hand. The last entry, The most recent, the handwriting more unsteady than the earlier ones, but still precise, still carrying its intention through the shakiness. The cave holds everything. If she comes, if the girl comes, she must clear the entrance. The vines are the door. What's behind them is the answer. Iris pressed her palm flat on the page. She, not anyone, not someone. She. Flora Blackwood had known as she was coming. A grandmother Iris had never met, had built something inside a mountain, and spent the last years of her life waiting for a granddaughter to come and open it. She sat in the chair at the table and breathed. Then she went to find the cave. She did not find it that day. The hillside behind the cabin rose at an angle that suggested it had no particular interest in accommodating human movement. 40, maybe 50 degrees of pitch, and every inch of it covered in vegetation so dense and layered that the ground itself was invisible beneath. Kudzu had colonized the lower section entirely. Curtains of it, ropes of it thick as her wrist. Wild grapevine wove through the kudzu in a mesh. Virginia creeper covered the rock face underneath whatever the kudzu hadn't taken. Honeysuckle filled whatever gaps remained after all of the above. The whole hillside was one continuous living wall, green-black in the March light, beautiful and impenetrable. She worked for 3 hours that first day with a hand sickle she found hanging on a nail on the inside of the cabin door. Her arms ached before the first hour was done. The kudzu roots had anchored themselves into the limestone in ways that resisted every technique she tried. She cut and pulled and cut again, and the wall of green barely registered her presence. At dusk, she went back inside and ate the last of the crackers she had carried from Charleston and sat at the table with Flora's journal and read from the beginning. Flora's handwriting grew steadier as she went back in time. The early entries were almost architectural in their precision. Soil depth at various points on the hillside, temperature measurements taken at different hours of different seasons, rainfall records going back 20 years, notes on species of fungi she had identified growing naturally on the surrounding oak and poplar logs, drawings of spore structures that Iris studied for a long time because she had never seen anything quite like them, and because the precision of the observation behind them was the kind of precision she recognized. She read until the candle burned down to nothing. Then she lay on the bed in her clothes and listened to the hollow, a creek somewhere below, an owl somewhere above, wind through the rhododendron that sounded, if you let it, like breathing, the silence of a mountain after dark, which was not silence at all, but a conversation between things that did not require human presence to proceed. She thought, I'm sleeping in a dead woman's bed in a state I have never been in before. She thought, this is the best night I have had in 6 years. The second day she worked from first light until her arms stopped responding entirely, and her hands had developed blisters in 3 specific places that told her exactly which muscles had been the least prepared for this work. She cleared a section of the lower slope she estimated at 12 feet across and got through to the rock face underneath. Limestone, gray and cold and smooth where the vines had compressed it for decades. She ran her hand along it and felt nothing unusual, no gap, no difference in temperature. She went back to the journal that night and looked at the map of the hillside. Flora had marked the cave entrance with a small X and a notation she had to read twice before she understood it. North face of the secondary formation below the rock split. Iris looked at the map. She looked at what she had cleared. She had been working the wrong section entirely. The third day she moved north, and the cave stopped being hidden. Not dramatically, not the way discoveries happen in the stories she had read under her blanket at St. Agatha's, where caves were found by lightning or moonbeam or by someone tripping over exactly the right stone. She was pulling at a section of kudzu near the base of the cliff, working her fingers under the root mass where it had anchored to the limestone. Her hands were bleeding in 2 places from the previous day's work, and she had wrapped them with strips torn from the hem of her oldest dress. She was pulling at a rope of kudzu as thick as her forearm, working her way along the rock face when she felt it. Cold, not the cold of rock or shadow, something different, something that moved, moving air, barely perceptible but entirely real, emerging from a gap in the vines she hadn't reached yet, touching her sweating face with a steadiness that told her immediately it was not wind, was not atmospheric, was something constant and deep and coming from inside, air from inside the earth. She went very still, put her hand over the source, felt the cave breathing. She cut faster then. She pulled vines until the sickle slipped and opened the cut on her palm again, and she wrapped it again without fully stopping. She hacked at grape stems and tore kudzu roots out of limestone cracks that had been growing since before she was born. The roots fought back. The mountain offered no particular encouragement. Her shoulders burned through her back and into something past burning that was simply effort of a kind she had never before required of herself. And as the afternoon light came through the canopy at an angle it hadn't found before, hitting the hillside in a new way, she saw it. Darkness. Behind the green, a gap in the rock face, maybe 5 feet wide and 6 feet tall, framed by limestone gray as a February sky, completely curtained by 30 years of unchecked growth, like a door that someone had very deliberately planted a forest over and walked away from. She cleared the entrance over the rest of that afternoon and the following morning. When she finally lit the kerosene lantern she found on the shelf in the cabin, when she finally held it in front of her and stood at the mouth of the cave and breathed, she was not afraid. She was ready, which was not the same thing, but it was enough. She stepped inside. The first chamber was natural limestone passage, 8 feet wide and just tall enough to stand in, running about 30 feet into the hillside. The walls were damp and the floor was smooth from centuries of water movement across it. The air was cool and constant, around 55 degrees. She estimated the temperature that caves maintain regardless of what season was conducting itself above ground. Water dripped somewhere ahead. Her footsteps echoed. She moved forward, and the passage opened, and Iris Blackwood stopped walking, because what was in front of her should not have been there, could not have been there by any framework she had been given for understanding what a cave in West Virginia might contain. The main chamber was enormous, 60, maybe 70 feet long, 30 feet across, a ceiling that arched up into shadows her lantern could not reach. But the size was not what stopped her breathing. What stopped her breathing was what was growing. Mushrooms, hundreds, thousands, covering every surface with the specific exuberance of things that had been given exactly the conditions they required and had gone absolutely extraordinary with gratitude. They grew from logs arranged in careful rows along the chamber floor. Oak and poplar, she could tell, cut to uniform lengths and stacked in configurations she had never seen, but that clearly had a system behind them, a logic. They grew from shelves carved directly into the limestone walls, those shelves packed with substrate material that was dark and rich smelling and had the layered quality of forest floor built up over many years. They grew from bags suspended from wooden frames bolted into the ceiling, hanging down in clusters, pale and luminous, catching the lantern light and seeming for a moment to hold the light rather than merely reflect it. And they were not just one kind. Iris walked forward slowly. Her lantern hand was shaking. She pressed her other palm against the cave wall to steady herself and kept moving deeper. Oyster mushrooms in gray and pearl and blue fanning out from log ends in overlapping cascades. Shiitake pushing through bark in tight brown rows. Something she thought might be lion's mane tumbling from a high shelf in white shaggy waterfalls. And deeper in a section where the temperature dropped another degree and the moisture sat heavier, something she had seen only in drawings, golden and ruffled, chanterelles or something very close. She crouched down and looked at one of the logs, old but not dead. The wood was still producing. Whoever had placed these logs had known something about how long fungi could work with a host, had known how to maximize productive life in ways that went beyond what the textbooks she had read could explain. She stood, and then she noticed something that should have unsettled her, but instead sharpened every thought she had. The substrate bags, some of them were old, dried and spent, but some of them were fresh, moist, added within weeks. The growing shelves, some of the material on the lower rows was clearly recent, added by someone who had been here and known exactly what they were doing. This cave had not been abandoned. Someone was still coming here, quietly, without claiming it, without making it known, just keeping it alive, just enough. She stood in the middle of her grandmother's cave and turned in a slow circle and thought, who and why? And this changes everything I thought I understood about what I walked into. When she came back down the path in the late afternoon light, there was a woman sitting on the porch step, 60-something, short and built with the solidity of someone who had done physical work their entire life and had no particular plans to stop. Gray hair in a braid over one shoulder. She was wearing an apron over her coat, which meant she had come from something and had not extensively planned this visit. She was holding a jar of honey. She looked at Iris with eyes that were performing a complete inventory. "You the Blackwood girl," she said. Iris set down the lantern. Iris Blackwood, Hattie Grove. She did not stand. 2 miles down the creek. Did you know her while Flora? Hattie turned the jar in her hands. Yes. Did you know about the cave? A pause that was not hesitation exactly, more like the pause of someone deciding how much of the truth was appropriate for a first conversation. I knew she grew mushrooms, Hattie said. Iris sat down on the step below her. She was too tired to stand and too attentive to go inside. She brought me baskets of them for 20 years, Hattie said. Best thing I ever ate. When she got too old to tend the full operation, she sealed it up, said it would keep until the girl arrived. She told you about me. She told me a girl would come. Not Iris by name, not yet, but a girl, a specific girl Flora had been waiting for. You have been keeping it alive, Iris said. Hattie looked at her without speaking. The substrate bags, Iris said. The material on the lower shelves. Someone added fresh material within the last month. Someone has been going in there. She watched Hattie's face. Not enough to make it thrive, just enough to keep it from dying. Hattie was quiet for a moment. That had decision in it. Then she said, not much use in letting 30 years of work die when it didn't have to. You did it without anyone asking. Flora didn't need to ask me things. Iris looked at the honey jar. She also, Hattie said, would have wanted whoever came to have something sweet the first week, because the first week up here is not easy. She held out the jar. So there's that. Iris took it. The jar was warm from being held a long time. She sat on the porch step of her grandmother's cabin with a jar of honey and a woman she had known for 4 minutes, and the knowledge that below her in a limestone hillside, something extraordinary had been growing in the dark for 30 years, being kept, waiting for her. She was 16 years old. She had arrived with a cloth bag and 6 years of being told she was the state's problem, and someone had built her a miracle. She did not cry, but she held the honey jar with both hands, the way you held something you meant not to drop, and she felt the warmth of it move from her palms up into her chest. And, for the first time since she could remember, clearly enough to count, that chest was not hollow. Hattie Grove came the next morning, before Iris had finished lighting the stove, not because she had been invited, because she had decided she was coming and had not seen any reason to announce it in advance. She knocked once and opened the door and stood in the frame with a sack over her shoulder and the expression of a woman who was going to teach something, whether or not the student had requested instruction. "You know how to split wood," she said. "No," Iris said. "Good. It's easier when nobody's taught you the wrong way first. Come outside." That was how Hattie taught, directly, without preamble, without explaining why a thing mattered before she showed you what it was. She taught Iris to split wood with the grain and not across it, to read which log would split clean and which would fight you, and to not waste energy on a fight you could predict in advance. She taught Iris to read the sky for weather, to identify which stretch of the creek ran clean enough to drink and which collected runoff from the old mine that had leached into the water table over decades, to patch a roof with split shingles, to bank a fire that held through the night without burning the cabin down. She taught her which plants on the hillside were edible and which would put her flat on the ground for 2 days. She moved through the surrounding woods with her hands reading leaves and stems and bark, the way some people read newspapers, with total familiarity and no particular admiration for their own ability. She did not explain how she knew these things, and Iris did not ask, because asking would have slowed everything down, and Hattie did not have patience for slow. "Your grandmother knew all of this?" Iris asked one afternoon. Flora knew more than this. "Did she teach you?" Hattie looked at her. Something moved through her expression that was not quite grief and was not quite pride, but lived in the territory between them. "Other way around," she said, and went back to showing Iris the difference between a chanterelle and a jack-o'-lantern mushroom, which could be the difference between a good meal and a very bad night, and which was exactly the kind of knowledge that Iris had spent 6 years at St. Agatha's being taught was beneath consideration. Iris ran the cave on Flora's instructions, which meant on Flora's journals, because the journals were instructions, dense and specific, and occasionally brilliant in the way that someone who has spent 30 years figuring out something alone is brilliant, which is a different kind of brilliant than what gets taught at universities, but no less real for being self-constructed. She learned the substrate formulas, wood chips combined with straw and spent coffee grounds in ratios that Flora had arrived at through what appeared to be decades of trial and documented error, every failed batch recorded in the same precise hand as the successes, because the failures were information too. She learned how to inoculate fresh logs with mycelium culture taken from the living logs already in the cave, a process that required patience and the right temperature and a steadiness with the material that took weeks to develop. The cave's temperature never varied more than 2 degrees. Flora had understood this. had mapped the natural airflow through the cave system and positioned every element to work with what the mountain already provided. The humidity held steady at 90% without her doing anything. The limestone walls filtered the water that seeped through. Everything Flora had built operated in concert with conditions that already existed, which was the most efficient kind of building there was. Iris spent 3 full days reading before she touched anything in the cave. Then she started repairing what had been neglected. She replaced the dried substrate bags with fresh ones mixed to Flora's specifications. She refreshed the log positions and assessed which ones had productive life remaining and which needed to be pulled and replaced with new rounds she cut from the surrounding forest. She re-squared and re-bolted 2 of the wooden ceiling frames that had warped with moisture. The cave responded, not immediately, not dramatically. Within 3 weeks, the existing fruiting bodies had more than doubled. Within 6 weeks, Iris was harvesting more mushrooms than she could eat in a month, which meant she needed somewhere to sell them. She walked to Whitesville for the first time in late June, carrying a basket that was the heaviest thing she had carried in a long time. 12 miles round trip on a mountain road that had opinions about being a road. The market in Whitesville ran on Saturday mornings. Mostly women, mostly tired, mostly buying the same things from the same people they had bought from for years: cornmeal, canning salt, dried beans, the staples of a region that was counting sugar rations and watching its men get shipped across 2 oceans, a region that was doing what it had always done, which was endure, but doing it with 1 fewer resource than usual. Iris sat up at the end of a table nobody was using and laid out her mushrooms. The silence that followed had the specific quality of a room full of people who had all noticed something and were waiting for someone else to address it first. A man named Earl, who sold feed from a truck, wandered over with the energy of someone who had decided to be helpful. "What's wrong with them?" he said. "Nothing," Iris said. He looked at the oyster mushrooms, pearl gray, wide and layered. "Why do they look like that?" "Because they're oyster mushrooms." "Where'd you grow them?" "In a cave." Earl stared at her with the expression of a man who had received exactly the information he needed to form a complete negative opinion and had done so efficiently. "Cave mushrooms," he said. "Yes, probably poisonous." "They are not poisonous." "That's what you'd say if they were." He walked away. So Iris stood at her table and waited. She had spent 6 years not being asked to be somewhere and had become very good at remaining in spaces that hadn't specifically requested her presence. The woman who finally stopped was Lucille Barton. Iris learned her name later. What she knew in the moment was a woman maybe 30 thin, in the way of someone who had been rationing herself before she rationed her children, 4 of them in a loose cluster behind her, the oldest maybe 8. A face that had been pretty not long ago and had been worked down to something more honest and more permanent. She looked at the mushrooms. "You grew these yourself," she said. "Yes." "In a cave." "Yes." "What do they taste like?" "Like the forest," Iris said. "Cleaner, though. Better fried in butter if you have it. Salt. That's all they need." Lucille Barton looked at the mushrooms for a long time. Then she looked at Iris. Then she counted out 10 cents from her coin purse. That was all it took. Not a speech, not a demonstration. Just one woman deciding that she was going to feed her children something unfamiliar because she trusted, something in a 16-year-old girl's voice, and because hunger had a way of loosening certainties. The following Saturday, Lucille brought her sister. The Saturday after that, the sister brought 3 neighbors. By September, Iris had a line. She spent her evenings with the journals. not the practical ones which she had absorbed enough to run the cave competently, the theoretical ones, the sections where Flora was thinking rather than recording, working through something on the page, rather than documenting something she had already decided. These sections would have been categorized as philosophical in any official context, but they struck Iris as the clearest description of something real that she had encountered anywhere. In the journal dated 1931, an entry she returned to many times. The mushrooms are not separate organisms. They are the fruit of a single vast network, a web of threads running through the soil and the wood and the stone itself. You can take the fruit without damaging the network. The network regenerates. The network communicates. Feed the network and it feeds you. The cave is not a farm. It is a living thing, and I am its keeper. Iris copied this into her own notebook. She drew the network as she understood it from what she was observing in the cave, the mycelium spreading through the substrate, the way a log inoculated at one end would eventually produce mushrooms at the other end weeks or months later, because the network had moved through the wood the way a message moved through a telegraph line, slowly but certainly. Flora had understood something that no scientific literature she could access had yet formally described, that fungi were not passive, that they were active and dynamic and communicating in ways that did not require nervous systems or language. She had understood this in a limestone cave in the mountains of West Virginia by watching carefully for 30 years and being willing to write down what she saw rather than what she expected. Iris thought about the 6 years she had spent at St. Agatha's being trained to iron other people's linens. She stopped at thought. It was not a useful one. She kept reading. She found the deeper passage on a Tuesday in October. She had been mapping the back section of the main chamber with the same attention Flora had given the hillside, documenting everything systematically. There was a section behind the primary log rows where the temperature dropped another degree or two and the humidity increased. Flora had mentioned it in the journals as a zone suited to cold weather species that couldn't sustain themselves in the main chamber's conditions. Iris had been measuring and noting this section for several weeks, and then she looked at the wall. Not a wall exactly, a section of collapsed limestone at the far end of the back zone. Rocks that had come down from the ceiling or from behind the cave face and completely blocked what appeared to be a passage continuing further into the hillside. She held her lantern closer. Limestone, consistent with the rest of the cave, but the way these particular rocks were arranged was wrong for a natural collapse. The base courses were flat to the ground, the upper courses angled inward. This was not how rock fell. This was how rock was placed. Someone had built this blockage from the inside. Someone had stacked these rocks against the passage entrance deliberately with care and walked out through the main chamber and left it sealed, which meant whatever was on the other side was something Flora had specifically decided to protect with something more than the vines she had used for the outer door. Iris sat on the cave floor for a while. Then she started moving rocks. 3 days. She moved rock for 3 days before the passage was clear enough to squeeze through. The rocks were heavy, and the space was confined, and she had to carry most of them one at a time to a pile near the main chamber wall where they wouldn't obstruct anything. Her hands blistered, and the blisters broke and reformed, and she wrapped them with whatever she had and kept going. Hattie came on the second day and said nothing about what Iris was doing, but set food down near the cave entrance and refilled her water jar and left, which was the most useful form of support Iris could imagine. On the third afternoon, she squeezed through the gap she had made and stood up on the other side. Her lantern hand was shaking. The back chamber was smaller than the main cave, maybe 20 feet across, drier. The air was different in quality, more still, carrying a smell that was different from the mushroom chamber, drier and older, like the inside of something that had been closed for a long time and been careful about it. Along every wall, on shelves that Flora had carved directly into the limestone with the same methodical precision she had applied to every other element of the cave, were jars, hundreds of them, mason jars, canning jars, old medicine bottles with tight-fitting lids, every size and shape of glass container that held a seal, and every one of them sealed and labeled in Flora's handwriting. Iris moved to the nearest shelf, lifted the first jar, held it up to the lantern. Seeds, small, dark, packed carefully into the jar with a square of cloth pressed over them before the lid closed. The label said, "Cherokee Purple Tomato, from my mother's mother, 1887. She put it down carefully, moved to the next. Bean seeds, corn, squash, peppers, herbs in smaller bottles, flowers she couldn't identify at first glance. Every jar labeled, every label with a name and a date and often a lineage. From my grandmother, from Lucy Parrish, from the Koala collection saved 1904, greasy back bean, candy roaster squash, bloody butcher corn, 1902, turkey craw bean, rattlesnake pole bean. Names she didn't recognize from any agricultural catalog she had ever encountered, because these were not catalog varieties. She understood this slowly, walking the shelves, reading labels in the lantern light. These were not the seeds that seed companies sold. These were the seeds that existed before seed companies, the varieties that indigenous and Appalachian farmers had selected and saved and traded across generations, the adapted strains specific to this climate and this soil and these mountains, developed over hundreds of years by people who understood that seeds were not a product but an inheritance, and they were disappearing. She knew this from Flora's journals. Seed companies were pushing hybrid varieties that couldn't breed true. That required farmers to purchase new seed every year. That created dependency. The old varieties were being crowded out because farmers were making practical decisions in practical times, and the old seeds required work that the new ones made unnecessary. Except here they were, 200 of them at minimum, perhaps more. She pulled a jar from the lowest shelf, sitting slightly apart from the others as if it had been placed last, and with particular care. The label said Cherokee Trail of Tears bean, from Lucy Parrish, 1894. She held it in both hands, and then she saw the envelope. It was sitting on a small flat stone that Flora had positioned at the exact center of the room, set there the way you set something you meant to be found. The stone was maybe 8 inches across, placed by itself on the floor, and on the stone a sealed envelope. Iris crossed to it, took it up. The handwriting on the front was Flora's, more deliberate than the journal entries, as if she had written it, knowing it would need to survive and be read under circumstances she couldn't fully predict. For my granddaughter, when she comes, not if, when. Iris sat down on the cave floor and pressed her back against the limestone wall and held the envelope in her lap. She was not afraid. She was solemn. That was the word. The shape of solemn, but with something warmer running through it. She opened the envelope. 2 pages. Flora's handwriting dense and clear. She read, "My dear Iris, I have been building this place for 30 years. I have been keeping it for you for that entire time, even before I knew specifically that you would come, because I believed that the right person would come to it, that the right person always comes if what you have built is worth finding. There is something I need to tell you about the property. I am putting this here because when it comes to matters of land, in these mountains, paper needs to be kept somewhere that lawyers cannot casually reach. They will come. They have come before. A man named Briggs, or his representative, or someone like him, because there has always been someone like him in every generation I have known. They will bring a document, a loan agreement signed by me from 1923. It will look official. It will have a notary seal. It will describe a debt that would, if unchallenged, transfer this land and everything on it to the Triton Seed Company. The document is fraudulent. I have never borrowed money from Triton or from any entity connected to them. They came to me in 1921 and I told them no. They came again in 1923 and I told them no again. The third time in 1925, I told them that this land was not mine to sell because it belonged to everything that was growing on it and in it, and that it would continue to belong to those things long after I was dead. They did not receive this answer well. The document they will produce was prepared after that third visit. I know this because I have a letter from a witness. His name was Carol Fitch, and he was the notary clerk Triton paid to prepare the false document. He came to me in December of 1927 and told me what he had done and what he had been paid to do. He wrote it out in full and signed it, and I have kept it in this envelope. Take it to any courthouse in Boone County. It will be enough. Iris reached into the envelope, found the second paper, a different hand, cramped and urgent, and carrying the specific quality of handwriting produced by someone who had made a decision and was moving fast before they could unmake it. Signed Carol Fitch, December 1927. Witnessed by two other names, notarized with a seal she could read and verify. She read it twice. It described everything Flora had said: the preparation of a false loan document, the amount paid, the names involved, the date and location of the transaction. Flora had been ready for them, for 20 years, had placed the evidence in the most secure location available to her. Limestone, temperature controlled, dry, the same chamber she trusted with the seeds that had taken a generation to accumulate. Iris sat in the cave with the letter in both hands and thought she was not strange. She was not a recluse. She was strategic. The same woman who understood mycelium networks 30 years before mainstream science would articulate them had understood that the most dangerous threats required preparation that looked to the casual eye like nothing, like vines over a cave entrance, like a sealed stone door, like a jar of Cherokee Trail of Tears beans on a shelf in the dark. Briggs arrived on the last Thursday of October. A car came up the path in a way that announced it had not been made for paths like this. The man who got out was 50-something, not large physically, large in the way of someone long accustomed to his presence, mattering in rooms, and who had therefore stopped distinguishing between rooms where it should and rooms where it shouldn't. Dark coat, good hat, shoes already acquiring mud they hadn't been intended to encounter. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the cave entrance on the hillside, visible now, no longer hidden. He looked at Iris on the porch with her hands in her pockets. "You're the Blackwood girl," he said. "I'm Iris Blackwood, Orson Briggs." He adjusted his hat. I represent Triton Consolidated Agricultural Holdings. I know who you represent. Something recalibrated in his expression. Then you may be aware there's a matter of an outstanding loan. I'm aware of the document, she said, which is a different thing than a loan. He stopped. You're 16, he said, as if this were somehow a response. I am, she said, and you'll want to have your attorney review the enclosed materials before you proceed further. She held out the envelope. She had transferred the Carol Fitch letter into a fresh envelope that morning. She had done it carefully, noting the condition of each document, noting the witnesses' names. She had moved it from the cave to the cabin and then to her coat pocket. Briggs looked at the envelope. He did not take it immediately. What is that? He said. The original notarized statement from Carol Fitch, she said. Who prepared the false loan document for your father's company in 1923 and came to my grandmother 4 years later to explain what he'd done and what he'd been paid to do, witnessed by 2 additional parties, admissible in any West Virginia court that examines it. She could see him processing this, could see the calculation. She was not afraid of him. She had been afraid of Sister Agatha for 6 years, had been afraid of the 30-foot wall of kudzu on the hillside, had been afraid of the cold air from nowhere and the darkness behind the sealed stone door. She was not afraid of a man in good shoes who had misjudged the terrain. Take it, she said, so your attorneys can look at it before you come back. Briggs took the envelope, opened it, read. The silence lasted long enough for something to move through the trees on the ridge above them and continue. Then he folded the paper back into the envelope with the careful movements of a man resetting. We'll be in contact, he said. I expect so, she said. He got back in his car and drove down more carefully than he had driven up. She watched until she couldn't see the car. Then she went inside and put the kettle on and sat down at Flora's table and laid her hands flat on the wood. Briggs would not stop. She was not naive enough to think one inconvenient piece of evidence would end this. A company like Triton had lawyers and time and the resources to reframe the same problem in different terms until they found one that worked. But Flora had known they would come. Flora had prepared. And the same woman who had understood the mycelium network before anyone else had written it down was not the kind of woman to prepare insufficiently. The kettle began. She got up, made the tea, sat back down. She had work to do. Briggs came back twice that winter. The first time he brought a younger attorney who spoke with more precision and less warmth, who presented what he described as additional documentation of the loan transaction and invited Iris to verify signatures at the county courthouse. She told him she would be in touch. She was not in touch. The second time, Briggs came alone in January on a day when the temperature had dropped low enough that the mud had frozen solid and the path was easier to walk than it usually was. He stood at the bottom of the path and she stood at the top of it, and he told her without particular heat that his company was prepared to wait. People always eventually need things, he said. She looked at him from the top of the path. I notice you're not coming up, she said. His expression shifted slightly. Pardon, you're standing at the bottom. You've stayed at the bottom or in the yard every time you've come here. She let this settle. Triton wants the seeds. That's what this is. Not the land, not the cave. You need what's in that back chamber to stop existing in someone else's hands. A property claim is how you get there. Something moved in Briggs' face. Not respect exactly, but the specific adjustment of someone who had made an assumption and been caught making it. We'll be in contact, he said. He left, and that was the last time Orson Briggs came to Keeney's Hollow in person. Letters continued to arrive from attorneys in Charleston and Huntington. Each one questioned some element of the Carol Fitch document: the age of the witnesses, the chain of custody, the legal standing of a minor to hold property under relevant statutes. Iris answered each letter in careful handwriting and kept copies of every exchange in a metal box under the bed. She answered because silence could be read as abandonment. She answered because Flora had done the same. The operation grew, not quickly and not without setbacks. She lost a batch of substrate to humidity miscalculation in August. She lost a week of production in October to contamination she caught late in the eastern bags. She pulled what was contaminated and burned it and started over. This was the other thing Flora's journals had prepared her for, not success specifically. The specific texture of failure in this kind of work, which was not catastrophic but persistent, and which could only be answered with the same quality of persistence. Every failed batch was recorded in Iris's notebooks the same way Flora had recorded hers, because the failure was data, because data was the most useful thing she had. By the second spring, she had regulars at the Whitesville market, women who came specifically for what she carried. A woman named Pearl who drove from 2 towns over because her husband had decided that what Iris sold was the only thing he wanted on his plate on Sundays. An older man named Delmar who bought lion's mane every week and had started cultivating his own after Iris taught him how, and who came back anyway because he said hers were better. She suspected he came back because the walk to the market was good for him and the mushrooms were an excuse that satisfied his dignity. She did not say this. She was 16, then 17, then 18. She stopped counting after a while because the count had stopped being the interesting number. Hattie Grove's health began to change in the spring of 1944. Not suddenly. The way light changed in October forests by degrees barely noticeable day to day until you realize one morning that it had gone from one quality to another entirely without announcing the transition. Hattie's walk slowed. Her hands, which had been extraordinary instruments, lost some of their sureness. She still came, she still taught, but she sat more than she stood, and on serious cold days, she did not come at all. Iris brought food to her on those days: mushroom broth, cornbread, jars of the dried herbs she had learned to identify from Hattie herself, which created a small private irony she kept to herself. They sat at Hattie's small table and drank tea and talked the way they had always talked, which was directly and without performing sentiment, but with an underlying warmth neither of them would have called what it was in any conversation someone else could hear. "You're going to be fine," Hattie said one evening in November. "I am fine," Iris said. "No." Hattie looked at her over the rim of her cup. "I mean after." Iris looked back at her. "After. The cave will keep," Hattie said. "The seeds are safe. You know what you're doing now. You didn't when you came, but you do now." "I learned from the journals," Iris said. "You learned from them," Hattie said, "but you also learned the part that can't be written down, which is the harder part to get." She set down her cup. Flora spent a long time waiting for someone who could do both. Hattie Grove died on a Thursday morning in December of 1944. Not dramatically. She simply did not get up. Her neighbor below the creek found her when the smoke stopped coming from the chimney, which was the only sign she needed. Iris walked 2 miles through the snow that morning when the neighbor came to tell her. She sat with Hattie for an hour before anyone else arrived. She held the hand that had taught her everything practical she knew about surviving on this mountain, and did not cry because Hattie would have found it wasteful, and because the relationship they had built did not require tears as evidence of its depth. It had deeper evidence than that. She buried Hattie on the south slope of the property, where the afternoon light came through longest and steadiest. In the spring, she planted Cherokee purple tomatoes on the grave, which were the truest thing she had, that Hattie had loved, and which seemed therefore like the correct conversation to continue. She had not known that grief could be so quiet. She understood now. 1945 was Iris alone. The mushroom operation, the seed vault which she had begun documenting systematically, the correspondence with Triton's attorneys, the Saturday market in Whitesville, the terraces she had been clearing on the south-facing slope, planting the heirloom varieties one at a time, as she understood each one's requirements, reading each plant's needs from Flora's notes and then from the plants themselves, and always the journals. She was reading the early ones now, the 1910s and 1920s. These were different from the later scientific records, more personal, more uncertain, the writing of someone not yet sure that what she was attempting would come to anything but attempting it anyway, because the alternative was not attempting it, and that was clearly worse. She planted, she harvested, she answered Triton's letters and kept her copies and waited for their next angle and answered that. She was not afraid of them. She realized this one March evening in 1945, walking back from the cave with a full basket and the specific satisfaction of a day's work that had gone the way it was supposed to go. She had been afraid for most of her life. The orphanage had run on the architecture of fear: behave or be punished, conform or be made invisible, be grateful or be reminded how easily nothing could become less than nothing. She had nothing here by most assessments: a cave, a collection of seeds that a company in Charleston was still trying to take through paperwork, 14 acres of steep hillside that the state had sent her to as a joke. But she was not afraid, which was, she thought, on the walk down, the most significant thing the mountain had given her, more significant than the mushrooms, more significant than the seeds, the specific absence of fear, and not because nothing threatened her, because she had learned the difference between threats that were real and threats that only worked if you believed in them. Ward Parrish came in April of 1946. She heard footsteps on the path before she saw him, which meant he had walked up from the road, which meant he had not arrived by car. She was on the porch checking the condition of the roof after winter when the footsteps came around the rhododendron. He was maybe 26, tall, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from physical work done before and during and now after a war, and quiet in the specific way of someone who had seen things that they were now keeping somewhere other than in their face. He was wearing a work coat that had been washed a great many times. He looked at her. Iris Blackwood. Yes. My name is Ward Parrish. From Mingo County. He held his hat. I heard you were growing things up here that nobody else could grow. She looked at him with the assessment Hattie had spent 2 years teaching her, looking for the angle, the real question under the stated one. That's true, she said. I'm studying agricultural extension through the GI Bill, he said. I wanted to see what you've built. She looked at him one moment longer. Then she stood up from the roof inspection and said, Have you eaten? He hadn't. She made mushroom soup and cornbread and watched him eat with the focused attention of someone who had not had a proper meal recently and was managing not to make this apparent through a combination of pride and considerable effort. Where did you hear about this place? She said. Man in Whitesville. Which man? Earl, at the feed store. She almost smiled. Earl said I was growing things nobody else could grow. Earl said you were selling cave mushrooms, and they were probably poisonous. Ward looked at his empty bowl. I figured anything Earl was that suspicious of was probably worth investigating. She did smile then, small. What are you actually looking for? She said. He put his spoon down, a pause that had real weight in it. My grandmother's name was Lucy Parrish, he said. She was Cherokee, from the Qualla boundary. She died in 1941. Iris went very still. Before she died, she told me about a woman she had known, a woman she had given seeds to, indigenous seeds, Cherokee varieties that were being lost that her family had kept for 3 generations. She gave them to this woman because she trusted her to keep them safe. He looked at her. She told me the woman had a hollow in Boone County and a cave with the right conditions, and she made me promise when the war was over to find out if the seeds were still there. Iris stood up from the table. She went to the shelf where the journals were arranged by year and pulled the one marked 1910 to 1912. She opened it to a page she had read before and read again, always finding it interesting without being able to say exactly why until this moment when the why arrived all at once. She placed the journal on the table in front of him and pointed to the passage. He read it. Lucy Parrish came today. She came a long way to find me. She had heard through someone who knew someone that there was a woman in Keeney's Hollow who had a cave with the right conditions and who could be trusted. She brought 7 varieties that her family has been keeping for 3 generations. She stayed 2 days. We talked through most of both nights. She is the most extraordinary person I have ever met. Ward read this passage and then read it again. His jaw shifted in a way that had loss in it. She kept them, Iris said. All of them. Iris looked at him steadily. Come see, she said. She took him into the cave. She watched his face move through the mushroom chamber the way her own face had moved the first time she walked through it. The lantern light, the thousands of white and gray and pale gold forms growing from every surface, the scale of it, the living silence of it, which was a different kind of silence than the silence outside. She brought him through to the back. She held the lantern up. He stood in the entrance of the seed vault and did not speak. She counted past 20 before he said anything. All labeled, he said. Yes. He moved to the nearest shelf. Read. From Lucy Parrish, 1910. Move to the next. From Lucy Parrish, 1910. And the next. From Lucy Parrish, 1910. He turned around. She had never seen someone's face hold that many things at once without making a sound. He put his hand briefly over his mouth. Then he sat down on the cave floor. She looked for these, he said. After she gave them to Flora, she sometimes wondered if she had done the right thing, worried about them. She died not knowing if they were still safe. He stopped, started again. She died not knowing. Iris sat down across from him. They're safe, she said. Not a complicated statement, but the correct one. He stayed 3 days. He helped her work the South Terrace, which she had been building for 2 seasons, but which had a drainage problem she hadn't fully solved. He looked at it with someone who had studied the relevant science recently and also understood from his grandmother's knowledge which plants supported soil stability on steep slopes and which depleted it. They worked alongside each other with the practical directness of 2 people who both preferred doing a thing to discussing a thing. On the 3rd evening, sitting on the porch in the cooling air, he said, I'd like to help, if you'll let me, not just with the seeds, with all of it. She looked at the hillside. "What kind of help?" she said. "The kind that requires being here," he said. She did not answer immediately, because she had spent 4 years building this alone, because she had spent 4 years before that being taught that her value consisted entirely of what she could do for someone else, because she had learned the specific cost of trusting people who were not worthy of it and had no particular desire to learn it again. "You came here for the seeds," she said. "I came because I promised my grandmother," he said. "I'm considering staying because of something else entirely." "What?" He looked at her with the directness he brought to everything that mattered to him. "Because what you've built here is the most honest thing I've ever seen," he said. "And because I think I could be useful, not to the cave, to you." She sat with this. Then she said, "There's a spare room." He moved in the following week. Dr. Agnes Fenwick arrived in October. Ward had written to her through a professor from his GI Bill program who knew of Fenwick's ongoing work documenting heirloom variety loss across Appalachia. His letter described the contents of the cave vault with the specific technical vocabulary of someone who understood the scientific context and the full scale of what he was describing. Fenwick drove 3 hours from Huntington in a car that handled the path considerably better than Briggs's had, because Fenwick was the kind of person who adapted to conditions rather than expecting conditions to accommodate her. She was in her 50s, gray-haired, glasses that sat consistently at the end of her nose. She looked at everything with the focused precision of someone who had spent her career learning to be exact about things that resisted exactness. She shook Iris's hand and said, "Show me." Iris took her into the cave, into the main chamber, into the back. Agnes Fenwick went through the seed vault the way she went through everything systematically, shelf by shelf, pulling jars and reading labels and making notes in a small leather notebook she had ready before they reached the entrance. Iris and Ward stood near the passage, waiting 40 minutes, an hour. Fenwick came back to them with tears behind her glasses, which she was not hiding or explaining. "Do you understand what you have here?" she said. "I'm learning," Iris said. "Some of these varieties." Fenwick held up a jar. "Bloody butcher corn, 1902. The last documented cultivation of this strain was 1919. We considered it gone, entirely gone. 20 years of attempting to reconstruct it from written descriptions." She held the jar with both hands. "It is not gone." She cataloged for 3 days, 214 distinct varieties: bean, corn, squash, tomato, pepper, herb, flower, traceable in many cases to specific Cherokee and Appalachian farming traditions that predated European settlement of the region by centuries, a living record of agricultural knowledge accumulated over generations and now preserved in sealed glass jars on carved limestone shelves inside a mountain in Boone County. On the 3rd day, she sat down with Iris and Ward at the table and said, "I'm filing documentation with the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This collection meets the criteria for federal cultural heritage protection. Any attempt to seize, transfer, or destroy it without consent from the relevant cultural communities would constitute a federal violation." "Triton," Iris said. "Cannot touch it," Fenwick said. "The protection extends to the property as the documented site of a cultural resource." She paused. "They may still pursue the debt claim." "The debt document is fraudulent," Iris said. "I have the original notarized witness statement." Fenwick looked at her. "Then you win," she said. There was a specific quality to those 2 words, not triumphant, just factual, the way you stated a thing that had become simply true. Briggs sent one more letter in the spring of 1947. It came from a different attorney in a different city, written in the neutral tone of someone distancing himself professionally from what he was conveying. The letter acknowledged receipt of the federal cultural heritage documentation. It stated that Triton Consolidated Agricultural Holdings was withdrawing its claim to the property at Keeney's Creek Hollow. It included no apology. Iris folded it and placed it in the metal box with all the others. She never heard from Triton again. She found the entry in Flora's journal on a Sunday morning in June of 1947. Not looking for it, she had been going through the 1926 volume looking for a specific substrate formula she had misremembered and needed to confirm. The formula was on page 43. She found it. She confirmed it. And then she turned to page 44 because the light was good and she was already there. The entry was dated October 1926. The handwriting was different from the formulas and diagrams. It was the handwriting Flora used when she was thinking rather than recording, when something was happening inside her that needed to reach paper before it moved through her and dissolved. I went to Charleston this week. My son wrote that he had a daughter born in September. I could not stay away. I told myself I would not go. I went. I held her for perhaps an hour in the afternoon while her mother slept. She has her father's eyes, which are her grandfather's eyes, which means she has something of mine in her, though you would not know it from looking. She is very small. She has a way of paying attention that is complete. She looks at a thing and is entirely there, looking. The way you look when you know that looking matters. I sat with her for an hour and I knew. I don't know how to explain the knowing. It was not a voice and not a vision and not any of the dramatic things people describe when they claim certain knowledge. It was simply a fact that arrived in me the way weather arrived, without announcing itself, just present. This is the girl. This is the girl who will come. I don't know when, and I don't know what will need to happen before she arrives, but she will arrive. And when she does, she will clear the vines. She will go in. She will find what I am building for her. I need to make sure it is worth finding. I need to make sure she has everything she needs. I held her for an hour, and then I put her back and came home, and I got back to work. Iris put the journal down, put both hands flat on the table, looked at the window. Outside, the summer was doing everything summer in West Virginia did in June. The Cherokee purple tomatoes on the south terrace had climbed higher than her waist and were setting fruit for the first time, the heavy dark clusters forming along stems she had planted from seeds in a jar that had been sealed in darkness for 30 years. The hillside above the cave had been cleared back enough that the cave entrance was visible from the cabin now, no longer hidden, no longer sealed, just there, a door in the limestone that she used every day. Flora had held her. When she was 7 months old, a woman she would never consciously know she had known had held her in a room in Charleston and looked at her face and decided, had come home, had spent 20 more years making sure there would be something worth finding, had written her name on the letter, had placed it in a sealed stone room in a cave inside a mountain, and trusted that she would come and clear the vines and find it, not if, when. Iris was 20 years old, and she sat at a dead woman's table in a house she had been told was worthless, and she understood for the first time with her whole self that she had never been worthless. She had been the reason. She had been the point of all of it. Not because she was extraordinary, not because she had been chosen by anything mystical, but because a woman who paid careful attention had looked at her face at 7 months old and recognized something, and had trusted what she recognized enough to spend the rest of her life preparing for it. Ward was in the south terrace when she came out. She walked down from the cabin and stood at the edge of the terrace and watched him work for a moment without speaking. He looked up. He read her face with the attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. "Come here," he said. She came. She handed him the open journal, pointed to the October entry. He read it all the way through, looked up at her. "She held you," he said, "once. And she came home and spent 20 more years making sure you'd have somewhere to come." Yes, a pause that was very full. "Is that the most extraordinary thing you've ever heard?" he said. Iris looked at the cave entrance on the hillside, at the limestone her grandmother had carved in 1913, at the door that had been under the vines all along. "Yes," she said. They were married that fall in the hollow on the south terrace in full harvest. Cherokee purple tomatoes, so dark they were almost black on the vine behind them. Candy roaster squash in great orange arcs along the fence. Greasy back beans winding up every vertical surface they could find. Corn taller than Ward, which was saying something. Seeds from sealed jars that had waited 30 years, growing because someone had understood how to keep them through the waiting. Dr. Agnes Fenwick came, and a few of the women from the Saturday market in Whitesville who had become something like friends over 4 years of Saturdays, which was a friendship built slowly and without ceremony, the only durable kind. The minister was brief and sensible. Ward looked at her the way he looked at everything he was serious about, which was directly and without performance. She looked back the same way, which was enough. They had 3 children in the hollow. The first 2 learned to tend the cave before they learned to read, because Iris taught the way Hattie had taught her, which was to show the thing before explaining why the thing mattered. The third arrived, seeming to already know what the cave was. She walked in alone at 4 years old and stood in the main chamber and looked at the mushrooms with the complete focused attention that ran in this family, the attention that meant you were fully in the place, you had arrived, and had no intention of being anywhere else. Ward expanded the mushroom operation into a proper business over the following years. Restaurants in Charleston and Huntington, and then further. Dried mushrooms through the mail. He trained other families in the county to start their own cultivation using methods Iris had derived from Flora's journals, which she wrote down in terms that could be followed by someone starting from nothing, because she knew exactly what starting from nothing looked and felt like. Fenwick came back every summer. The collection grew every year. New varieties came through the network Fenwick had built from communities across Appalachia, from the Quallaboundary, from family farms in Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee, where people had been saving seeds in their own ways for their own reasons, without knowing that anyone else would care. Seeds that arrived in paper envelopes and mason jars, and once in a handkerchief tied at the corners by a woman who had driven 6 hours because she had heard there was a place that would keep what she had been keeping and add it to something larger. Iris cared. She had always cared. That was the part that hadn't needed to be taught. The Blackwood Parish Heritage Collection was formally recognized by the Department of Agriculture in 1954. By 1961, it held 412 distinct varieties. By 1968, over 600. People came from everywhere to see it. Scientists, students, farmers who had heard about what was in the cave and needed to see it before they could believe it. Journalists who wrote pieces that brought more visitors, who brought more seeds, who expanded what Flora had started into something she had perhaps imagined and perhaps not. They all walked through the main chamber and saw the mushrooms glowing in lantern light, and then Iris took them to the back chamber and held the lantern up. Every one of them went quiet, not the polite quiet of visitors being respectful, the genuine quiet of people encountering something that exceeded what they had prepared themselves to encounter. A reporter from the Gazette asked her once whether she was angry at Sister Agatha, at the laughter in the dining hall, at the people who had called the cave worthless and the inheritance a joke. Iris thought about Earl at the feed store, certain that cave mushrooms were poisonous and declining to investigate further, about Briggs standing at the bottom of the path year after year, coming close but never walking up some part of him, understanding that whatever was at the top of the path was beyond what he could take. They couldn't see past the surface, she said, the vines, the overgrowth, the girl nobody wanted. They thought that was all there was. And you knew it wasn't. No, she said. I didn't know anything. I just had nowhere else to go. She looked at the reporter. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the only thing between you and finding something extraordinary is the fact that you have no other option but to keep walking toward it. She was 60 years old when she took her granddaughter to the cave for the first time. The girl was 8, dark-haired, attentive in the specific way that had moved through this family, like a gene, the quality of looking at a thing completely and not moving on until she had understood it. She had her great-grandmother's eyes, which had been her great-great-grandfather's eyes, which had been Flora Blackwood's eyes, which was the kind of continuity that didn't announce itself but was real. She stood at the cave entrance and put her hand on the limestone. It's cold, she said. Yes, Iris said. Why is it colder here than outside? Because the cave is breathing, Iris said. The air inside stays at a constant temperature all year. When it meets the outside air, you can feel the difference. The girl considered this with complete seriousness. What's inside, she said. Iris looked at the limestone above the entrance, at her grandmother's initials carved there in 1913 by a woman with a chisel and a plan and 30 years of patient work ahead of her. At the second line, her children had added below 20 years after Iris herself had arrived here. Flora Blackwood, 1913, Iris Blackwood Parish. She cleared the way. Everything, Iris said. The girl looked at her with her great-grandmother's eyes. Will you teach me? She said. Iris took her granddaughter's hand, and they went inside.